For over 100 years, the most powerful empire in North America wasn't Spain, it wasn't France, and it even wasn't the US. It was a nation of horseback warriors that most people have never been taught to think of as an empire at all. The Comanche didn't just resist colonization, they stopped it cold, repeatedly, against 4 different world powers for longer than the US has currently existed as a country, and they did it without states, without a written language, and without anything resembling the empires we're used to picturing. Here's how a handful of scattered horseback bands became the single greatest obstacle to European expansion in the history of North America. Rewind to the early 1700s. The Comanche aren't even really the Comanche yet. They're a small offshoot of the Shoshone, pushed out of the Great Basin and onto the southern plains. On paper, they're nobody, no territory, no numbers, no reputation. Then they get horses. Spanish colonization had introduced horses to the Americas, and by the early 1700s, feral and traded horse populations were spreading across the plains. Most plain nations adapted to horseback life gradually. The Comanche didn't adapt, they specialized, harder and faster than anyone else on the continent. Within a couple of generations, Comanche riders were widely regarded, including by their enemies, by the way, as the finest light cavalry in the world. Not for native warriors, not for the era. Full stop, among the best mounted fighting forces anywhere on earth at the time. And they used that advantage to do something almost nobody expects. They built an empire. Historians now use the term Comancheria to describe it, a territory that at its height in the 1700s and 1800s stretched across what's now Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. That's an area larger than most European countries. And unlike the empires you learned about in school, the Comancheria wasn't run from a capital city with a king on a throne. It was a decentralized network of autonomous bands, loosely aligned, moving constantly, controlling territory not through fixed borders, but through raiding range, trade dominance, and sheer reputation. Here's where it gets genuinely wild. Spain had been expanding across North America for 200 years. By the time it ran into the Comanche, Spain had already conquered the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire. This was the most successful colonial power the hemisphere had ever seen. The Comanche stopped them. Spanish colonial expansion into Texas and the northern frontier of New Spain didn't just slow down in the 1700s. It reversed. Spanish settlements were abandoned. Missions were pulled back. By the late 1700s, Spain was paying the Comanche tribute and negotiating as an equal power, not a conqueror dealing with a subject people. Let that sink in for a moment. The empire that toppled the Aztecs was paying protection money to a nation of horseback riders that hadn't even existed as a distinct people 100 years earlier. Then it's France's turn. French traders operating out of Louisiana wanted access to Comanche territory for the same reason everyone did. Furs, horses, captives, trade routes. The Comanche didn't reject the trade outright. They were sophisticated economic operators who ran one of the most active trade networks on the continent, centered on horses, captives, and buffalo products. But they controlled the terms completely. French colonial ambitions west of the Mississippi ran straight into Comanche military and economic dominance, and largely state-contained east of it. Then Mexico wins independence from Spain in 1821 and inherits the same problem, except worse, because the new Mexican state has even less capacity to project military force onto the northern frontier than Spain did. Throughout the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, Comanche raids into Mexican territory are so severe, so sustained, that the entire region of northern Mexico depopulates. Ranches are abandoned. Settlements shrink or vanish. Some historians argue this weakening of Mexico's northern frontier is one of the underappreciated factors that made Texas and eventually the Mexican-American War go the way it did. Comanche weren't a footnote to that history. They were reshaping the map before the US ever got seriously involved. And then, finally, the United States. This is the part people think they know. Native nations resisted, and eventually the US won. That's true eventually, but it took decades, and it wasn't close to easy. Comanche warfare was built around a devastating combination: extreme mobility, extraordinary horsemanship, allowing warriors to fire arrows and rifles from a full gallop while using the horse's body as cover, and an economy built to sustain constant long-range raiding rather than static defense. US military commanders repeatedly noted that conventional infantry and tactics effective against static positions or slower-moving forces struggled badly against an enemy that could outright outmaneuver and simply vanish back into a territory the size of a small country. It took the US Army until the 1870s, after the Civil War freed up massive military resources, and after the industrial-scale slaughter of the buffalo deliberately targeted Comanche food supply and economic base, and after decades of relentless, grinding campaigns to finally force the last free Comanche bands onto reservations. The final surrender, led by the Comanche leader Quanah Parker in 1875, closes out roughly a century and a half of Comanche dominance over the southern plains. A century and a half, for context, that's longer than the Roman Republic lasted from its founding to the point where most people would say Rome had already become something else entirely. So why doesn't this get taught the way, say, the Aztec or Inca empires get taught? Partly because Comancheria doesn't look like an empire to eyes trained on Rome or Egypt. No pyramids, no monumental architecture, no written records left behind in their own language for historians to work from directly. The entire framework Western history uses to recognize empire, cities, monuments, centralized bureaucracy, just don't apply to a nation whose power was built on mobility, horses, and controlled violence across open territory. But strip away that bias and look at the actual outcome. 4 separate colonial powers over 4 separate eras tried to expand into the same territory, and all 4 were stopped, slowed, or forced into negotiation by the same people. That's not a footnote in someone else's history. That's one of the most successful, sustained resistances to colonization in world history. And most people have never heard a single detail of it. The Comanche didn't have an empire because someone handed them a map and a crown. They built one on horseback, out of raw military and economic dominance, and held the most militarily powerful nations on earth at bay for longer than most European monarchies have lasted. That's not the story you were taught, and it's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Thank you and good night.